Hello, and welcome back to our podcast series on all things coaching in higher education. I'm your host, Tim Jansa, a certified leadership and organizational development coach and a higher ed professional of almost 20 years. One of the issues that keeps popping up in conversations, both with guests on this podcast and with friends and colleagues in the higher ed space, is the topic of burnout and working through trauma. And since I have experienced personally both as a result of a dysfunctional and toxic work environment, this is an issue I'm truly passionate about. For that reason, I'm genuinely excited to have with me a bona fide expert on this topic. Dr. Rebecca Pope-Ruark is a certified professional coach and author of several books on burnout among college faculty and staff. I can't wait to find out what she can teach us about working with clients who have reached the end of their psychological tether. So let's explore how coaches can make a real difference in helping colleagues who struggle with burnout and trauma. Hi, Rebecca. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for the invite.
It seems to me like ever since the COVID pandemic hit higher education really hard in the spring of 2020, and at that time forced faculty and staff all of a sudden to pivot and do the things that for years they had been told that weren't possible, more and more of our colleagues are feeling stretched thin, emotionally exhausted, and disconnected from the work they may once have loved. So from your perspective, what's driving the rise in burnout and workplace trauma amongst faculty and staff these days, and how are you seeing this show up in your coaching work?
Yeah, I think COVID was definitely an instigator or a facilitator of pushing over the edge what was already there. A lot of faculty and staff were stressed out to the max anyway. We were doing more with less constantly, right? But budgets in higher ed have been dropping for decades now and not rebounding. So there's been a lot of that deep stress and some of that institutional betrayal in the way things were handled prior to COVID. And then that just got exacerbated during COVID. So I think that people were expected to, like you said, work from home, be basically constantly online to support students to get them through what was happening. So the students were experiencing trauma. We're all experiencing a global trauma at the same time. And then faculty and staff too were getting the secondary trauma from students as well as they were struggling through that process, the pandemic. And then it never really rebounded after that, right? The stress never really went back to quote unquote normal prior to COVID, which was already high, right? We were already stressed out. But now there's additional layers, I think, of the stress. And we know that burnout is a workplace stress disorder, right? It's not a personal problem that you bring to the workplace. It's not something that's wrong with you as a human being, right? It's an inability to manage toxic levels of stress, which, most typical human beings cannot manage that consistent level of stress all the time. And it almost never feels like there's a recovery period, right? You can think to spring break or you can think to the summer, but there's always something else you have to be doing as a faculty or a staff member in higher education during those time periods. So there really isn't an end of project or an end of semester deep rest or recovery time that people need. So that stress just keeps building up. That keeps building up, and then people can't handle that. Some of the typical things that happen during the day because of that just heightened stress level that becomes a constant. So how do I see it in my coaching practice? I see people who are exhausted. They're just exhausted, and you add AI onto the COVID bump. You add what's currently happening in our country to that stress, and and that's not even talking about people's stress at home, right? Caregiver stress, if you have children or you're taking care of older parents, we're not even talking about bringing that into the mix yet. So it certainly impacts how people are able to address stress. But I see a lot of people who are exhausted. I see a lot of people who are worried about their productivity. There's three things we're looking for with burnout, right? We're looking for extreme exhaustion. We're looking for cynicism or depersonalization of those you work with. And we're looking for reduced professional efficacy. We need all three of those for a diagnosis. And I think cynicism kind of comes and goes in higher ed. I think a lot of us are just kind of cynical naturally. But when you start to really feel that question your efficacy, wonder if you're actually doing your job well, or if maybe you're not able to do certain aspects of your job well, that's a lot of what I'm seeing in coaching with faculty that I work with.
There's two things that really stuck out to me. The first one is a great reminder that, of course, as faculty and staff, it's not just us and our jobs and our personal lives. We're experiencing stress, but also especially those of us who are student facing. students' needs have definitely shifted. I think they've probably become a little more intense, as you mentioned. I mean, because they're all still dealing with lots of upheavals, and not just during COVID. I mean, now we're looking at AI and all the technology advances, and there's just a lot of stress. But the other one, and I wanted to ask you about that a little bit. You mentioned in institutional betrayal, because when I was thinking about our conversation, one thing that I have noticed, there seem to be two types, or maybe like two sides or two aspects of burnout. On one is, of course, excessive workloads, and then just the physical exhaustion that brings with it.
Mhm.
But there's also what I have experienced, and that falls really under the institutional betrayal part, when your values and the work you do seem to be in completely misalignment
Mhm.
with what you are doing. I think a lot of our staff colleagues probably experience that. We were just doing work. We don't really know what for, the processes, the procedures, the policies, the bureaucracy, none of it makes sense. Would you say that this is an acute observation? And how does that potentially also impact the coaching dynamics when you're
Mhm.
working with somebody who's just physically exhausted versus
Mhm.
somebody who also has that value misalignment?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some of the original burnout researchers, Christina Maslick and Michael Leiter, wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Burnout Challenge. And they talk about their research where they show that there are 6, I think they call them misalignments between the worker and the workplace that lead to burnout. And workload and values misalignment are 2 of those particular issues. So yeah, so you're right on that observation. I think oftentimes when I see people who are exhausted, it's less physical and it's more emotional and even intellectual, right? You don't have any brain space to work with people or to collaborate or to, have civil conversations. You're just really kind of down in it. Or they are just emotionally exhausted, right? They're tired of dealing with other people's challenges and their own issues at the same time. And students, their needs have shifted since COVID. We've definitely seen that. They are way more willing to share their problems with faculty members than maybe they were in the past, and a lot of faculty and staff as well. And a lot of folks aren't really sure what to do with that. They feel like they're not counselors, so they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they don't want to damage or impact a student negatively, so they're not really sure what to do. But I think the values piece, when we think about institutional betrayal or institutional trauma, right, it's that toxic work environment, or it's the stress level that you just cannot manage. There was a lot of feelings of institutional betrayal coming out of COVID with how certain return to works were handled. And that kind of lingered for a long time. And it's left some pretty deep scars, I think, for a lot of faculty and for administrators, right? They didn't make those decisions lightly. Many of them were forced into those decisions by state governments or things like that. So none of it was easy, and none of it was easy for anyone to kind of manage. But what I see a lot in coaching is, how do I figure out what my priorities are? And what if my priorities are not aligned with my institution? They're often aligned with what the institution says are values, but not what is enacted sometimes, right? You see those enacted values. So I think that's the issue. And when that comes to coaching, we want to clarify what your values are. Let's do a values exercise. Let's understand where your values are. Let's understand where the conflict is. And then we can think about, what do we do about this?
You brought up what I think is really a crucial issue at the root of what we're dealing with as coaches, and that is the line between coaching and therapy. Because it seems like when you're working with trauma and burnout, it easily goes or crosses the line into therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, Rebecca, how do you draw that line? When do you know when to step back as a coach? And how do you potentially set guardrails when you're working with your client so that you're in alignment with your client of what you can and cannot do?
Yeah. And I try to make it clear early on. And I will often refer clients to therapy. And I think those two things can work in concert if they're done well and the client knows kind of what the distinctions are, right? When we think about therapy, we think about really mining the past and understanding things that have impacted you in the past and how to address that. It's also A therapist is more qualified to deal with mental illness per se than a coach is. And there's no shame as a coach saying this is beyond my capabilities. I don't have the training to support you in this way. And I think it would be beneficial for you to see a therapist who are differently trained and able to help you mine the things that happened in the past that are holding you back now, right? When we think about coaching, we're starting in the here and now and the future. So if the client is ready to do that kind of work, then we can move forward. But if it really seems like we're mired in the past in a lot of ways, that could be a clue that therapy is a better option for this person. There's a researcher out of New Zealand who has been doing burnout research recently, and he has put together what he calls like 3 levels of burnout. And this is Nick Petrie's work. And he says that there's like that first level, which is just stress. You're stressed out and, basically you just need to set some boundaries and have some self-care and decouple yourself from your work for a while. Then you get into that middle level when you're in that chronic stress place. There's no hope for rest or recovery. And then you really need to set some boundaries. You really need to start saying no to certain things. You may need to have a conversation with your supervisor because it's starting to impact your work. And then there's that third level, which is full-blown burnout. And at that level, which is where I ended up myself as a faculty member, you basically need to stop or you're going to do more damage to yourself mentally and physically. So you need to stop therapy, potentially working with a coach. You need to examine your life and decide what you want in your life and what you don't want in your life anymore. And that for some people means changing jobs, changing roles, moving, getting out of the environment where that trauma happened. So I like Nick's version of thinking about those levels. I think it gives us a basis for saying, the first level where you're just in a period of stress, that's coaching can handle that, right? We can definitely handle that. When you start moving into the other 2 levels, you're definitely more into therapy issues right there.
So you already, touched on your personal experience. Mine, as I mentioned in the intro, was somewhat similar. I mean, of course, I was on the staff side, but I was dealing with the after effects of a reorganization gone terribly wrong. So I'm not going to go into details here. But mine was definitely at the point where I needed to leave, and that's exactly what I did. I remember that day when I talked to my spouse and I said, if I stay in this job, I can't guarantee that I won't have a complete mental or physical breakdown before the end of the year.
Yeah.
Would you care to go a little bit into your experience and your story with burnout and potential trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it before in different places. I was a tenured faculty member at a wonderful liberal arts institution focused on undergraduate education, which is exactly what I wanted to do once I knew that college teaching was something I could do and aspire to. I wanted to teach. I wanted to work with undergraduates. So I was in the place that was perfect for me in a lot of ways. But I think we often train our young academics to just think that they have to continue to push, take on more and more. They have to be leaders. They have to start something so it just becomes so big that you kind of lose yourself in the work. I was working all the time. I was working when I went home. I was working on the weekends. I was constantly pushing, trying to get things out, trying to do research while I was also teaching with a heavy teaching load. I was also starting to lead some initiatives on my campus, had a particular experience with a couple groups of students that led to some trauma, I think, in terms of, I won't go into what happened, but led to some trauma for me personally. And that ultimately kind of kicked off the burnout. I think I was headed in that direction. I think I had pushed myself too hard for too long. I was kind of sick all the time and I was miserable and I was cynical and it just really wasn't me at all. And people noticed. They didn't say anything about it until after I kind of ended up on medical leave for burnout. But people had been worried about me for a while and just weren't saying anything. Because, I mean, how do you say that, right? You're a chair or you're a senior faculty member in someone's office suite. How do you talk to someone about that? We don't know how to have those kind of compassionate conversations in a lot of ways. So some of the work I do now is working with leaders on how to have a compassionate conversation with folks who are burned out so that it's not just, I don't know what to do, right? Who do I punt to help you get the help that you need, right? So I was kind of on my own. Not that people didn't care about me, they just didn't know what to do, right? Because it's not something that people bring to the table very often, especially go-getters. I think they just keep going, and then sometimes they move, and you don't really know why they've changed jobs, or they get into other roles to get away from certain things, right? So I had this kind of really negative experience, had a pretty close to a break, I think, a mental break, and ultimately ended up on medical leave for a semester. Did a lot of therapy work on myself, medication to Because it's, burnout is also comorbid with other mental illnesses. We think of burnout as a syndrome, not a mental illness per se, but it is comorbid with other things. So it exacerbates things that are already problems for you. So my anxiety and my depression were through the roof, and really unmanageable in a professional sense. So it was necessary for me to stop and do some reevaluation of what I wanted in my life, and that stress was not what I wanted in my life anymore. And I decided that I was done with teaching for a while as well. I liked working with faculty. I'd been doing some of that on the side and was able to find a role. Wasn't even intentionally really on the market. I was just seeing if I was marketable, and ended up in a role that was good for me in faculty development. So, but I had to make some serious life changes, that affected my whole family, and we moved, and it's not the path that I expected to be on, but it's the path that I need to be on now.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate you sharing that, being so open about it. Every burnout and trauma experience is very personal, but I think what's so devious about it is it creeps up on you.
Yes.
It's not like you just, you notice, oh, I'm getting burned out. No, you just stressed. You might feel tired, and those behavioral changes that you mentioned are also exactly what I experienced. The cynicism. This wasn't me. I was constantly angry. I was snapping at people, which is so unlike me. And it wasn't until later, same thing. People said, golly, you've been acting strangely. And then, of course, again, there's a trigger event, I think, a lot of times that just brings it home. It's like, oh man, I'm not in a good place. So what you were just addressing really seems to be a systemic issue of burnout. And I know on the faculty side, certainly, especially those on tenure track, there's always this expectation and demand of always producing, and conference presentations and publications and teaching evaluations. There's all these metrics. On the staff side as well, and then we have institutions who very much, that almost valorizes this idea of constant busyness and never being able to have time to reflect. So within that, you can't change the system as much, even though you address this idea of compassionate conversations. Is that an idea, or is that a one approach where you might nudge the system a little bit in a direction where it's a little more forgiving and helping people avoid burnout?
Yeah, and I think I'll refer to Kevin McClure's work on the Caring University. I think everyone should be reading that right now, and thinking about that, because we spent a long time not thinking about higher ed as a workplace, and we need to think about it as a workplace because it's gotten us into some trouble. So I think that, yes, compassionate conversations is one way to prepare people to be empathetic in ways that maybe we're not naturally empathetic sometimes, especially in the workplace. So how do I have that conversation? And it's, in a lot of ways, it's a coaching conversation, right? You're listening to understand, you're listening to ask good questions. What do you need in this space? What can work to address this in the short term and the long term, right? So I think all leaders should be able to have those kinds of conversations. I think, burnout is a workplace problem, right? By definition, it is a workplace stress syndrome. So it's not caused by external things, although, your life outside of work can absolutely exacerbate your mental state. But it is a workplace problem. And as you said, I feel like it's a capitalism problem in a lot of ways. It's a neoliberalism problem. It just exacerbates all of that, right? So how do we start thinking about the level of work that is necessary and that is doable, but that is still fulfilling without being stressful or overly stressful, right? We want to challenge ourselves. We're academics after all, right? We like challenge, but we need to be looking for that optimal challenge space. And that is going to take a lot of work, right? That is a big culture shift. For some organizations or some institutions, maybe that means clearer promotion guidelines that take into account work-life issues. It is more attention as strategic priorities to well-being for faculty and staff, not just for students. We spend a lot of time on well-being for students, which is great. We should absolutely be doing that. But if faculty and staff working conditions are student learning conditions, then we also need to take care of our faculty and our staff as well. So, and it doesn't really look like monthly emails about taking care of yourself or exercising, right? I understand why we do it. I don't think it hits the problem, right? Sometimes it feels disingenuous. So I think it has to be a strategic priority, I think, for institutions. My institution, well-being is a pillar of our strategic plan. There are efforts around that for all audiences. So that means there's funding for it. But, part of the challenge is that you can address some of it at the institutional level, but it's a sector problem. It's a higher ed problem. So if one institution maybe backs off a little bit on the stress or on the promotion criteria, then there's a vacuum in a way for another institution, right? Because we're always competing for rankings. We're always, that's part of the problem. We have to work with people to help them individually. I think and coaching is part of this, help them individually figure out what success means to them, what that looks like, how it aligns with your values, what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, and being able to hold yourself to that and set those boundaries. So in addition to having it be a strategic priority. So I think it's a top up and a bottom down at the same time.
And it seems like there's increasing awareness amongst institutions because the turnover and the churn has been so high. And as we know, it costs a lot of money when you lose people and you have to onboard people and the work output and everything. It takes a while for that to adjust. And also, when you rip people out of that social network that we still have in our institutions, and you have people leaving who have tremendous institutional knowledge, that creates a major vacuum.
Yeah.
And so just to keep your folks and work on retention. By the way, you mentioned Kevin McClure's book. I have it sitting right here, The Caring University. I'm not all the way through yet because every page is marked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a wonderful book.
So much. It's a really good work, and Kevin is just a great guy.
Yeah.
Rebecca, I'm wondering, it's something that I've been meaning to ask you. Do you see a difference in working with faculty versus professional administrative staff in terms of their needs, maybe what led to the burnout, how it can be addressed or resolved? Is there something you have experienced there?
So I predominantly work with faculty in my day job and then in my private practice when I am doing that. So I don't deal with a lot of staff. I have done workshops with staff and they experience the same stressors that we do and sometimes more, right? Because I think you talked about turnover, right? There's been a lot of turnover and jobs not being backfilled because of budget issues, right? So you might be in an office that used to have 12 people and now you're down to 6 and you still have to do that work. So the workload issues I think are similar in a lot of ways, right? It's different kinds of work, but it is still work and is still workload that is exacerbating the issues. And I think that in some ways there was I was doing a podcast episode on my own podcast and I was talking to a guest and she said that higher education, an institution, should be the best place ever to work because it's based on learning. It's based on, bringing up young people. There's so many opportunities to go to lectures or hear people talk and learn about their research. And it should be the best place to work on the planet. But I think, that contract is a little broken. We're behind on salaries in a lot of ways. Some people will say administrative bloat is an issue, but as our institutions grow, we're at the demographic cliff, right? So I think we're all experiencing the stressors that are impacting our institutions. It's just what your individual context looks like that folks bring differently to coaching or a workshop.
I need to ask about identity, especially on the faculty side. And again, this is a topic that's popped up in multiple other conversations, but I'd love to get your unique spin on that because I'm just imagining when you're working with faculty who are all of a sudden experiencing some massive negative consequences of stress, of burnout, of trauma, and that must hit really deeply. Because all of a sudden they must get a feeling that what they're doing, who they are as an academic, as an employee at this university, as an educator, is not working for them or is not enough or is just hurting them. And that, of course, undermines our identity as academics. Is that something you're seeing as well?
I think that's a big part of it. I think because we're trained as if you're on the faculty side, at least, you're trained from a very early stage of your career that work is pretty much everything. Your identity gets wrapped up in being a scholar or a member of a certain faculty at a certain institution, right? So you look for validation through that part of your identity. And the other aspects can very easily go by the wayside if you're not very careful about it. So when you burn out, you feel like you suddenly can't do this job well, that there's something wrong with you, that suddenly you can't hack it anymore. And I think the initial impulse is to blame yourself rather than the workplace. It's why can't I do this anymore? What's happening? Because you're right. It's like hitting a wall. You don't notice it kind of creeping up. It's like lobster in a boiling water, right? I think that it builds until it crashes. And you can't necessarily expect the reaction that you're going to have, right? It's going to be different based on however your identity kind of is shaped in that institution. But it can feel very shameful. I think there's a lot of shame associated with feelings of burnout because suddenly you feel like you can't hack it anymore. And what's wrong with you? You are in a place where competence and your brain is valued above all else. And suddenly your brain isn't working the way it used to work and you can't focus, you can't think. It suddenly feels like there's a big furry wall between you and your thought process. So it can be really jarring. It can be really scary. It can be really shameful. And that absolutely impacts your identity. And I mentioned Nick Petrie's work earlier, and he talks about in the upper two levels of burnout, the chronic stress level and then the full-blown burnout level. He talks about actually finding ways to separate your identity from your work. And that is really hard for academics. It's really hard. And that alone probably requires therapy, maybe some coaching, depending on where you are in the stage, the burnout stages. So you're totally right. Your identity is wrapped up in that. And it's a big hit to your identity and to your sense of well-being overall.
I mean, you're okay. You think you're okay until you're not.
Yeah.
And until that moment comes. And then, of course, that creates a moment of real crisis. So one of the things I'm wondering, and I'm just putting myself into the role as a coach working with somebody who's suffering from burnout and trauma, because it's a moment of crisis, you're dealing with that, with the immediate intervention of helping them in that moment, hopefully preventing or avoiding something even worse. But then, of course, you also, being the coaches that we are, we want to look into the future and develop some more resilience and maybe give them some tools that enable them to prevent this from happening again, potentially within the system that they're working in. How do you balance these two? Because, I mean, you can't just focus on one and without the other, or do you? Or how does that work?
Yeah, I think it depends on the client and where they are in their journey with burnout or workplace trauma. I was so far gone by the time I got a diagnosis that it required medical care. A coach would not have been helpful at that point. And even if I had coaching, I would still have been in therapy multiple times a week. So I think it depends on where the client is. And some clients will self-diagnose, I think, at this point. There's a lot more awareness in the last 3 or 4 years about burnout and what it is and what it looks like and what to look for. So I think people are a little more open to talking about it than they were in the past. So I think that depending on where you are on the spectrum, you could still be at a place where some interventions could be useful and you might be able to kind of bring it back down. And some of that is the things we talk about for depression or the things we talk about just for transitions, really. So it's doing values work, really understanding what your values and your priorities are, thinking about how your daily activities fit into those priorities, what does and what doesn't fit, what gives or drains you of energy, thinking about how to balance those things a little bit more. So we talk about what balance looks like, that there's no such thing as a 50-50 workplace balance. Right. And we talk about seasons of life and we talk about when it's appropriate to focus on different aspects of your life. We do some boundary work. So actually talking about what a boundary is. I think, I've been talking a lot about boundaries in my workshops lately because I think we're often told you need to set some boundaries. But what is that? What does that even look like? What does that even mean to set boundaries, right? So do some work around what actually is a boundary. How do you set it? How do you actually verbalize it? Because if you don't verbalize it, then no one's going to know you have a boundary. And they will, of course, transgress it if they don't know it's there. And set boundaries with yourself, too. So, you have to really think about, is it serving me and my health to be checking my email at 10 o'clock at night every day? That's the easy one to start with is, setting some boundaries around your email, setting some boundaries around the hours that you will work in a day and will not work in a day. And that doesn't mean, going cold turkey and working 40 hours and not working in the evenings or on the weekends, because that's going to stress people out more. You build up to what you need and you experiment with what you need in terms of boundaries and saying no. Saying no is another one. Learning how to say no is really challenging for academics. We're always afraid that if we say no, they'll never ask me again, or no one will ever ask me to do anything again, right? And it's not a zero-sum game. Learning how to say no can be really useful in this case too. So there's some basic strategies that we can be working with folks on, maybe when they're not in full-blown burnout, to help them maybe mitigate some of those issues. And then I think once you get to full-blown burnout, you're probably in therapy territory.
If you could wave a magic wand, to use a nice little coaching question, and design an institutional culture system of intervention mechanisms, what would you put into that design? How would you create an institution that would prevent faculty and staff from even getting to the point where they are experiencing burnout? What should they be looking out for, and how could they address it?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a very different culture, right? It would be a very different world. In some ways, we'd have to start from zero to figure out what that looks like. The systems are built to do what they're doing, and they're doing it well. And that is not welcoming to everyone. That is not healthy for everyone, but it's a big machine at this point. So what does that look like? And I think there are some institutions that are kind of trying new approaches to what education looks like. Places like Olin and Harrisburg have done some really different things with building and new institutions. In the world that we live in, though, I think that it's really important for faculty developers and provosts and vice provosts for faculty and faculty excellence to be having conversations about what burnout looks like. So people recognize it in themselves and in others, and then having compassionate conversations. How do you approach someone who you're concerned about, someone who may or may not be interested in having that conversation with you, and just being supportive. So I think we do a little bit of training or education on how to be empathetic, how to be compassionate, going beyond empathy to compassion, and how to extend it as well as receive it. Because I think it's really difficult for people to often receive compassion in higher ed because you want to feel like you're an island. You're kind of trained to feel that way. So I think if we could build more community into our workplace, I think that would be really useful. And I think coaching has a role, right? I think coaching has a place that if I can be working with people who are starting to feel like they have some of the symptoms of burnout before they get to full-blown burnout, then we can do a lot of good supporting individuals who can then play that back to the community, right? Or engage that in the community. So they are more aware of their colleagues and their behaviors and their own behaviors and how they engage and what that looks like. And we can do more as leaders, for example, with our teams, having some education around burnout with our teams. So do I wish we could get to a point in a few years where burnout wasn't an issue? Absolutely. But we live in a capitalistic neoliberal society right now. So it's not really going anywhere unless we are proactively educating people on what to look for and how to take care of themselves in this context.
As I like to say, words to live, lead, and coach by. Rebecca, this was extremely interesting. Thank you for shedding some light on a very difficult topic, putting some light on what still is considered a stigma by some, because we're just not allowed to be burned out, and then all of a sudden we disappear. So thank you so much for bringing some attention to this. I really appreciate your wisdom, and we will make sure to put all those resources and the scholarship that you mentioned also on the companion side. So thank you for making time to be here with me today, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim.
And a big thank you goes to all of you, our viewers and listeners, for spending a little bit of time with us today. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot. And if you're interested in more information on this episode, our guest, and today's topic, please visit our companion website at higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. See you next time, and keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time.